We're now in 30 Auth Apollo, and if we go to the index file, we can see we have our usual version, type dest resolvers. We've got our context, and this time we've seen before where we can get the request object. And what we're going to be able to do is actually get some headers that we're going to be passing through so that we could pass on as needed. But what we're going to be doing is looking at authentication and authorization. Authentication being verifying who we are, authorization being whether we have a role to do something. And basically, if we look at, we're going to send in as our context, we're going to get access to some headers that have been passed through. We're going to send through some custom headers. So if we look at our playground, for example, we can use in this tab here headers. We can pass through custom headers. I'm passing through a custom header called NDC and NDC GQL2021. This can be used in various different ways. It can also be used to be passed on to REST APIs that do their own authentication, authorization via the use of headers. So we can pass that on. So if we come back here, we can sort of see we're also returning back a user object with a first name. We're giving it a special token. We're not working on using JOTs, JWTs, etc. We're just assuming we've done all of that, and we can send back a user object with their ID, their first name, a token which is prefaced by token and their name, because we can see different versions for different people. We can have a role, and this one here is initially admin. So let's do that here. We're going to call them an admin. And we can also see that we get the custom headers that we can pass through as the request.headers.ndc. So we're going to have two queries, and what we want to do is we want to do both authentication and authorization. And the first thing we're going to do is look at the so-called middleware pattern. And one way we can look at the middleware pattern is if we see here, if we have a middleware wrapper, we pass in the next function, the function we want. And in our case, we're always passing through the root or the parent args.context.info. We can do some business logic rules. We can always throw errors, do various things. Provided we are happy, we can return with next, the actual function itself, and pass in those same values through. So if we look at authorization and authentication, we can use the Apollo server authentication error object, but when we want to have this function called authenticated, it takes in the next function, which will have also its variables of root, args, context, and info. These will be the resolver. This next is effectively a resolver. And what we can do is basically analyze anything on the args or the context, throw errors, and then when we're happy with that, if it passes, we just pass on the function as before, having done our intermediary step. And in this authenticated function middleware, we're just looking to sort of see that it's got a token. We're stripping down that user token that we have in index. We have this token, we're stripping down there just to make sure it's got the first fiver token. That's just the way we're doing it in this one here. And then we pass it on. We can also have authorized that takes not only the next function but the role. And we're then saying if the role doesn't equal the role that we've sort of specified on the context, we must declare it role, and we then basically throw an error. So for example, if we pass an admin as our role, if there isn't the admin role on the user, it will throw an authentication error or any other custom errors. If not, it will proceed on. So what we can then do is when we're in Auth, we have these two functions. We can export them out, and in our resolvers we can wrap each of our functions, our resolvers, with that. So with user authenticated, where we would normally see this parent arg ctx info function, we can wrap it with authenticated. We're composing, the returning of one function is the input for the next function, authenticated. And we can see in our second query of user authorized, we're doing both authenticated and authorized. But in case of the authorized one, we've got to pass in what is the role. And for two functions, I think it's okay to kind of wrap one within the other. If you're having more, you would go into composing or pipe, where you'd see a different format of passing in functions. That's more functional programming style. But here we're basically wrapping up the middleware, the resolver, with authenticated and also authenticated and authorized. Of course, they can be combined into one and split. So let's actually look and see how this all works. So if we go to index, notice we're sending Larry, it's got a token, that's fine. They've got the role of admin. So if we go in and look at our query here, we've got two queries. Notice how we can use two here. We can go in here and put our cursor and do Control Enter. So is the user authenticated type query? Basically it must have a token. So if we come in here and do Control Enter, if we do the authentication one, we get failed to fetch. Please check our connection. I'm sorry, I'm not running the correct, not running it here. So cd courses -04 /30-auth-apollo, and we'll do npm run dev. So if we run that now, that's going to be running up on port 5000. If we come back in here into our playground, refresh. So for authenticated, notice we're sending here not in the queries but in the HTTP headers, we're sending in an NDC header, and this is the value of, this is the token in the header. If we come in here and do Control Enter, we can see user authenticated, the ID, first name. We don't have any values for last name or email. We know it's role, and this is allowed simply because in our authenticated, in our token, we have a token here. And if we look at our auth, we see that that is actually looking for something beginning with a token. So as long as it's got a token, it will carry on to the next function. So if we come back into index, let's close these down. Come back into index, and if we remove this token, so we say we don't have anything here, so that's not going to work. We save that again and we come back and we refresh. Authentication, you must have a valid auth token. And we're going to look at custom errors shortly, but we're coming back with that message that we see here in our auth file, which says you must have a valid token. Let's just see if this works when we, instead of saying next, we call it the resolver. This is just a parameter. Whether this makes it look a little bit easier. We come back in here, we refresh. Authentication, you must have a valid auth token. Well, that's still working. Let's go back into index.js and let's actually put back in that token. So that should satisfy it. If we run it again, authentication, that works. And now we can see in authorization we need a role. Well, we've got the role of admin here. So if we come in here and do authorization, that still works. User authorize Larry because they've got the role of admin. However, if we come back in here and we just change them to a user, remember in our type defs we said we had admin, guest and user, so it must be one of these, otherwise we'll get a GraphQL error. So if we come back into our index and put this down as user, let's do that, we come back in here, we save that, that's refreshing, that's working okay here. If we come back in here and we refresh authorization, you must have a role of admin, so that's working there. And so what we've seen in here is in our kind of resolver, we can basically call resolver or next. So here I'm using next, it's just a variable, but actually we're taking our resolver, these are the parameters of the resolver, and what we're going to do is we'll call this parent, as we've done before, parent, and that should all work. Next root, we need to change this here, all of that should work fine. If we come back in here and refresh, if we come into this one and if we do authentication works because we've got a token, but authorization doesn't because we've changed the role back. Let's go back into index and do Control Z, put it back as admin. Authorization, now that works fine. And notice we've got our headers here. So we could also do, in terms of our auth, we could also look at the headers, and because that's been passed through as user dot, if we look in here, we've got the custom header in the user object, we've got the custom NDC header. We could also do something based on the headers. or we could pass this on. If we're doing a REST API out to another server, we could pass on these headers, and that could do the authentication and authorization as necessary. So that's good. Let's sometimes see next. So putting that there, that's kind of fine, just to show the example. So that is how we can do authorization and authentication in Apollo. One way to do it. We'll look at custom directives next, where we can actually do an auth directive by actually placing something on a particular field at a lower level.